Okay, so good morning, everybody. We will be doing chapter 8 today in Shaar, Hayichud, the gate of unity and faith in Hashem. That is the name of this book of Tanya that we are learning. And just a reminder that basically the objective of this book of Tanya is to learn and understand everything that we can according to our grasp, according to our intellect's capacity, every person according to their own capacity, obviously, because everybody has a different level of intelligence. And the rest becomes pure faith. That's why it's called Shaar, Hayichud V'Emunah, because faith has nothing really to do with logic. And when people mix faith together with a little bit of logic, it loses the category of pure faith. That was just a little introduction because Sina reminded me what this book is actually called. Okay, so chapter 8 is a continuation. Well, obviously the whole sequence is a continuation, but chapter 8 continues the discussion we began in chapter 7, but from a different perspective. So the previous chapter, we actually discussed what is meant by lower level unity of Hashem. In other words, we call this Yichud Tata'a, lower level unity of Hashem, even though it kind of seems a little bit contradictory to call unity of Hashem lower level and higher level. But the truth is that all it is from which it's basically expressing from which perspective we see the unity. So in chapter 7, the Alter Rebbe had a lengthy discussion about unity of Hashem from our perspective and how the infinite Hashem is invested into the finite world, causing us to appear not to exist. But remember, it's not finite parts of Hashem in the finite world. It is the infinite Hashem within the finite world, but when it causes us to think that we are independent, but when we become aware of what is actually going on in the world through learning Tanya, then we realize that Ein Od Milvado, and that really it's all Hashem, and it's all an appearance because of the process of Tzimtzum and etc., and the way that Hashem actually created the world. Now, we did say, for example, that there is a power of Hashem which is not measured and not according to each individual creation. We called that Soivev Kol Almin, when Hashem, literally it means surrounds the world, but we could make a mistake, think that Hashem therefore is not within the world on this level. In actual fact, the Alter Rebbe explained to us that this is simply referring to a level of equality, of how Hashem expresses himself equally amongst creations, but is in fact very, very present within creation. So it's the very infinite Hashem within the finite creation equally. And then there is also the level of Hashem according to each level of creation, and we call that Memale Kol Almin, where Hashem fills the world. And it makes sense when we think about it, because a hand has a different power to an eye has a different power to a mouth, a nose, an ear, etc. Each one has a different power. But in the end of the day, it's all godliness concealed to us. From our perspective, it is concealed, except for the moments where Hashem chooses to reveal himself, which was mentioned previously, which are either through tzaddikim or through miracles, which don't happen constantly, but we can be on the lookout for them. And that's how we know what godliness actually looks like and how we strive always to reveal it. Now, the Alter Rebbe now in this chapter begins discussing the oneness of Hashem from Hashem's perspective. We touched upon it a little bit, and the discussion will begin in this chapter and continue into the next chapter. The creation of the world is not a contradiction to Hashem's oneness from Hashem's perspective, and also did not affect Hashem's oneness in any way, whether it's in his essence or his knowledge. So let's give an example to understand this better. Let's say you learn how to, you acquire a skill. You learn how to, I don't know, make a cake or use some technology on the computer, let's say, right? When you've learned that skill or knowledge, you are now different. You have acquired something new. It could even be a personal development skill. But once you've acquired a skill, you are not the same person as you were before. In other words, you have changed because of this new knowledge. When you paint a picture or you have a certain talent and you compose a song or whatever it is that you contribute to the world, you are a changed person. You have acquired something new. But with Hashem, it is not so. One would think that the creation of the world changed something in the creator, right, in the creator. However, it did not change anything in the oneness of Hashem, neither in his essence or in his knowledge, because of the fact that Hashem and his knowledge and his essence are one thing. And therefore, within Hashem, creation is non-existent because it's one with him. Let's explain this further. The Rambam writes, and we learned this in the last chapter, that Hashem and his knowledge are one. It's not a composite. In other words, you know, like how you take two pieces of paper and you glue them together so they join together, but they're not one thing? That's not Hashem. We are like that with our knowledge. We are us and our knowledge joined together. But Hashem and his knowledge are one. And the Alter Rebbe says that this does not only refer to Hashem's knowledge, but to all parts of Hashem. So Hashem's attributes, Hashem's names. We've seen Hashem being called by different names. Hashem's qualities, they are all one with Hashem. So in other words, when we say Hashem is Chanun, Virachum, merciful and compassionate, Hashem has an attribute of Chesed, Hashem is wise. All these things in a human being could be different parts to the human being. But in Hashem, it's all one. And it's the same thing not only with Hashem's attributes and qualities, but also with Hashem's desires. So we say about Hashem that he desires certain things. For example, Hashem wants those who fear him. Hashem wants the tshuva of the wicked, wants the wicked to return. Hashem does not want the death of the wicked. So Hashem has certain desires, but again, Hashem and his desires are one. They're not two separate things. In the same way that Hashem's knowledge or desires or attributes or qualities do not add something to him, unlike in a human being, the same goes for every single one of his attributes. All of Hashem's attributes are one, and Hashem's essence is one with him. It's not divided into parts. I don't know too much about the subject, but lately I've been hearing about a modality called internal family system, where you are made up of all sorts of parts. But what struck me when I heard that was like, that's us, but it's not Hashem. We are made up of all different parts, but Hashem is one, and all the parts of Hashem are one with him. However, being that we are human beings, this is not something that we can comprehend fully. We can comprehend that we are made up of parts, but we cannot comprehend that Hashem and all his parts and all his qualities and all his attributes and all his desires are one. Because on the one hand, Hashem is very far removed from the attributes, from his attributes. And when we say attributes, we're referring to the Sfirot, the 10 attributes, 3 intellectual, 7 emotional. Hashem is not wisdom. We can't say Hashem is Chachma. Hashem is wisdom. And yet we say that Hashem's wisdom is one with him. But we're not really able to comprehend this with our human minds. So is Hashem above wisdom? Is Hashem one with wisdom? Is Hashem wisdom? So the answer to that is that it's all of the above. At the same time that Hashem is removed from any attributes, his attributes are him. This is all from the perspective of Hashem. A human being, says the Alter Rebbe, comprehends things as they are in himself. So we are familiar with the words wisdom and kindness and these characteristics, right? But when we say, oh, Hashem is kind, what do we think of automatically? Of how a human being expresses kindness. When we say Hashem is wise, how do we think about this? We think to ourselves in terms of human wisdom, of how a human being is wise, how these attributes are expressed in ourselves. We are familiar with our own intelligence. But about Hashem, we say Hashem is Ram, Venisa, Kadosh Shemoy. Hashem is very, very, very elevated. His name is holiness, but Kadosh, the word Kadosh, also means separate and above. So Hashem is one with his attributes and above his attributes. Hashem is removed endless levels higher than the kind of praises and titles that we give him. We're not able to fathom what Hashem is. He is higher than any praise human intelligence can conceive of. At the same time, he is one with those attributes. So let's examine one of those attributes. And this begins a discussion that really continues into the next chapter. So even though we will be learning part of this discussion, please remember that we have not concluded this discussion yet. The Alter Rebbe says, okay, let's take, for example, the attribute of Chachma in a human being, wisdom in a human being. Chachma is the first sphera, is the first of the 10 attributes, right? And Chachma is actually the beginning of all creation. Why is it the beginning of all creation? Because Hashem used a system of creation, Seder Hishtalshelus HaOlamos, that's what it's called, a system of creation using the 10 attributes. So everything that Hashem created in this world, not only in this world, but angels and the above worlds, the spiritual worlds, and etc., all use the system of attributes. In other words, the tzimtzum of Hashem's light has to go through the 10 attributes. And therefore, remember that we've discussed tzimtzum, and tzimtzum is actually what enables creation. So therefore, the very first beginning of creation is the attribute of Chachma. From Chachma comes Bina and Das. So wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, right? Bina and Das are products of Chachma. But take all of these attributes, these intellectual attributes as one, and what do they produce? They then go on to produce the 7 emotional attributes. Now, I'm going to remind you of something that we've learned numerous times in Tanya, especially in the beginning. The Alter Rebbe specifically over here is speaking about the healthy, godly emotional attributes. Because what has to really happen is that the intellect, the wisdom of a person gives birth or produces the emotions of love and fear of Hashem. Remember that love and fear of Hashem are emotions, so they're included in the 7 emotional attributes. If we are using our animalistic soul, which is actually our default state, the order would be the opposite. The order would be emotions first, which stem from the heart, and then we would use our intellect to justify those said emotions. But here the Alter Rebbe is bringing the godly emotions. So from the emotions, from the intellect, come the emotions, intelligent emotions. The Alter Rebbe calls the godly feelings of love and fear Hashem intelligent emotions, because truly when we love and fear Hashem, that's when we really live a healthy, balanced life. with healthy emotions, right? So these are not the animalistic emotions, because the animalistic emotions do not come from our intellects. They come from our hearts. And the Alter Rebbe refers over here to the godly emotions such as love, kindness, rachamim, compassion, etc. Obviously, all used for godly purposes. Now, to understand how this is actually so, Alter Rebbe brings a very interesting example of a child in this chapter. So we know, right, that intellect has to give birth, has to produce healthy emotions of love and fear of Hashem, or any healthy emotions, really. If they come from our intellect, then they are godly and not animalistic. But what happens when you have a child, for example, who has not yet acquired the wisdom of an adult? And by the way, there are some adults that have not yet acquired the wisdom of adults as well. So when we speak about a child, we could be speaking about a child both in age and in stage, right? So a child who does not have wisdom, he could be angry and cruel because of his lack of wisdom, and he's also drawn to small and insignificant things. He doesn't have the knowledge yet to know what is deserving of love. As he gains knowledge, as a child matures, his love develops or becomes love for more worthy things. But when he's 2 years old and he doesn't really have a knowledge, then he loves toy cars and his dolls or whatever it is, right? And he could be cruel to another child because he doesn't have the wisdom to discern between one thing and another thing. So that's why wisdom is very important to produce the correct emotions with which to live our lives. The Alter Rebbe brings this example just for us to understand how the process works, from starting from chachma, intellect, until the resulting action that comes from that intellect. So how does it actually occur? We're talking now in a human being, because first the Alter Rebbe will explain how it works in a human being, and then we will say that in Hashem it is different. So in a human being, when you have used your wisdom, your godly wisdom, to produce emotion, a healthy emotion, that emotion creates a thought. Now, it's very interesting because usually we equate thought with wisdom, and we could really think ridiculous thoughts, actually, which are not wise at all. So the Alter Rebbe here makes a distinction between wisdom and thought, because thought is actually one of the expressions of the soul. It's not actually an attribute of the soul. So whereas the soul has 3 intellectual attributes and 7 emotional attributes, they then express themselves in thought, speech, and action. So the order is wisdom begets emotion, which begets thought. Thought then begets speech, which begets an action. Does that make sense? So the order is wisdom, godly wisdom, emotion, healthy emotion, which makes you think healthy thoughts. Then you want to reveal your thoughts, so you speak them, and you may be telling someone to do something, you may be speaking about an action you will take. The final destination is action. So again, the process is wisdom, emotion, thought, speech, and action. Now, emotion, in other words, each one prior gives energy to the one that comes after it. So wisdom gives energy to emotion, emotions give energy to thoughts, thought gives energy to speech, and speech gives energy to action. Okay, I wish I had there is probably a whiteboard on this Zoom thing, but I don't know how to use it. But yes, I hope you all understand what I'm talking about. But the energy of the act is actually insignificant to the energy which comes before it. So between each level, there's a huge jump in energy. So the energy of wisdom is insignificant when it's compared, well, no, opposite. The energy of action, let's go backwards. The energy of action is insignificant when compared to the energy of speech. Speech is insignificant when it's compared to the energy of thought. Thought is insignificant when it's compared to the energy of emotions. Emotions are insignificant when it's compared to the energy behind the wisdom. Therefore, if you take all those 5 stages and you compare wisdom to action, there is no comparison between the action and the wisdom that preceded it all, because action is actually an exterior thing to the human being, whereas wisdom is internal. So they're really, really vastly different. The speech, for example, is closer to the soul. The 3 garments of the soul are gradually further out from the soul. So whereas we have the wisdom of the soul and the emotions of the soul, thought is closest to the soul, speech is then a little bit more removed, and action is even more removed. So they're each quite far apart from one another, even though one results in the other. This is true for human beings, but to Hashem, it is all equally insignificant. In other words, we can't say that in a human being, thought is closer to the soul than action. But in Hashem, action, thought, speech, wisdom, emotions, it's all insignificant in the same way compared to Hashem. And that is going to be further discussed in the next chapter, in chapter 9. Okay, any questions? Yes, Sina, go ahead.
Okay. All of this whole line that you went down. So
I know it's a bit confusing.
Well, it's not that if it's confusing, but okay, so today I'm typing. I wrote that all down. How are we supposed to look at that? How's that applying practically in our lives? What does it mean to us? How does it appear in our life? What's an example of, so we can like wrap our head around it?
So there's actually two ways that we can understand this. First of all, there's the reason that the Alter Rebbe discusses this in general really is not an application does not have a practical application in our life, but the Alter Rebbe brings it for us to understand how everything that is in this world that is a creation, which begins with the attributes, is insignificant to Hashem. Just as like our action would be really insignificant to our wisdom, right? It's a very, very diluted form of the wisdom because it goes through all those 5 stages. In the same way, everything is insignificant to Hashem, and that discussion will actually continue in the next chapter. But the Alter Rebbe does bring it here in terms of godly wisdom, and that has a very important application to our lives, which is not discussed completely here, but I will mention it because it's so, so, so important. But it's actually the way we believe and think and act. In other words, our default state really is not according to a godly soul, simply because Hashem created the godly soul to be concealed. Godliness is concealed in this world, as we've been discussing up till now. But our mission, the purpose of creation, is to reveal godliness. So the same way as we have to reveal godliness in the world, we also have to reveal godliness within ourselves. How do we do that? By reversing the order of how things happen. And what do I mean by reversing the order of how things happen? Well, if our default state is that the animal soul dominates, how does that actually occur practically? It means that you feel an involuntary emotion in your heart. Specifically, Tanya says the left side of the heart, right? So let's say you feel a very strong emotion, such as love, hate, fear. It doesn't have to be a bad emotion, right? But it could be. Frustration, those are strong emotions. What usually happens is that your brain justifies it. So let's say you're very angry with someone, or you really are in love. Your brain is then going to process that and say, wow, you know why? Because you were disrespected, you were dishonored, you were stepped upon. She's so amazing, blah, 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 right? Your brain is going to justify whatever strong emotion you feel in your heart. So the order is heart first, brain second. Okay, that does not reveal godliness. That is just the default animalistic state of being. How do we reveal godliness and how do we do things a little differently? Because the issue with doing with following your heart, and it's actually one of the mitzvahs in the Torah not to follow your heart. The problem with that is that it can sometimes lead you down a path to act contrary to your values or the values of Hashem. So how do we reverse the order? We reverse the order by using our brain first and producing emotions second. So we can think godly verses. We've discussed this before, right? Even before Pesach, whoever came to the webinar, you can think different psukim from Torah. You can meditate on the greatness of Hashem. You can use different chapters in Tanya to actually help you do this. You can access what the world calls its higher self, your higher self. Your higher self is nothing more than your godly soul. That's your real self, not only your higher self, right? And that's the practical application, because what happens is the difference between acting upon the not acting, but justifying the involuntary emotion or changing the involuntary emotion. So we will always feel those involuntary emotions. We'll always feel that momentary anger, frustration. But Tanya says that the Beinoni will push that away. If you're not a Beinoni, if you're a potential Beinoni, many times you'll justify that emotion, right? But what happens when you push it away? Then you use your brain first to produce a different emotion. So let's say you're really feeling angry with someone. So you feel that anger, but you want to change that not because you shouldn't feel angry at the person should know that he stepped all over you or whatever. You don't have to become a shmata, but anger is not good for you. It's not a good state of being for yourself. You might do things contrary to your value system. So you push that thought away, but if you don't change the thoughts, you push the emotion away, sorry, but if you don't change the thoughts of justifying the emotion, then you won't be able to push it away. So what you do is you develop new thoughts, and it takes practice and repetition. And Tanya says that even if you don't believe what you're saying at first, just say it. You can develop, let's say, compassion for another person instead of judgment. Does that make sense, Sina? And one tool that I always love to use is affirmations. Love them. And affirmations is really like Chassidus applied. In other words, decide what it is that you want to be feeling and find either a statement or a pasuk in the Torah or in Tehillim to really produce that emotion. If you want to feel trust in Hashem, well, there are many verses in Tehillim that speak about trust in Hashem. Just dwell on those psukim and repeat them. And then you will be using your mind, your intellect, to produce a healthy emotion. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is speaking about in this chapter. That's the order, because otherwise the order would be inversed. If we were saying heart, wisdom, no. The Alter Rebbe is referring to wisdom, emotions, thought, speech, and action. Not emotions, wisdom, thought, speech, and action. That would be animalistic and not godly.
So
Yeah.
would it be true to say that when you want to trust in Hashem, you think of things or you read things that help you develop that trust, and then you sort of develop a new default, but a default reaction or emotion or what? Default what?
Yes. Yeah.
All of
You
that?
develop. You don't develop a new default. You get an upgrade.
Okay, so
Upgrade to
you,
your operating system. So
okay.
therefore, you change the default settings on your operating system. You are now upgraded, potential Beinoni or Beinoni version 2.0 or whatever it is. So you're basically, yes. And the thing is that we've discussed before the stages of learning, right? That when we learn, I think I may have mentioned in this class, right? The first stage of learning is you don't know that you don't know. The second stage of learning is that you know what you don't know. The third stage of learning is where most of us are at. And in personal development, it's actually where you want to be at all times, that it's called conscious competence. In other words, you have a new skill, but it's not automatic yet. So you really have to be like, you have to focus on it and concentrate on it to act in that way. Why I say that you always should be in that stage for personal development doesn't mean that you should be doing the same thing always, but once you've mastered the ability to change your thoughts, then you go on to the next stage of changing some other thoughts, or never to be like comfortable, because the fourth stage of learning is unconscious competence, which means you do things automatically, like riding a bike or driving a car. You don't have to think about it, right? So that's really a tzaddik. A tzaddik has completely transformed, but a Beinoni is actually not considered to be serving Hashem if he's not in the stage of constantly improving himself and constantly going to the next stage. Does that clear it up? Anybody else?
Yeah. It's a lifetime thing.
Of course. Yes, Panina.
I got it. Thank you. I really got what you're saying.
I don't hear you so clearly. Could you maybe speak a little closer? Now it's even worse.
Better now?
Oh, now it's better.
It's
okay.
It's better. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Okay. Yeah, now it's no Bluetooth. Okay. That was interesting, the part that you say that it's chachma, then emotion, then bina. No.
No.
When you say wisdom, emotion,
chachma bina and das, then emotions. No. Chachma bina and das, then emotions, which are the last 7 spheres, then thought, speech, and action.
Oh, okay. Wait.
We get confused because we think that thought is wisdom, and it's actually not. It's an expression. Thought is an expression of wisdom.
Chachma bina das, emotion, and then machshava dibur ma'aser.
Yes.
Got that. Okay. But here's my question. In the beginning of Tanya, it says we have two, a nefesh bahamas, nefesh like this. They both have Chabad, which births emotions. And I'm hearing you saying that the nefesh bahamas starts with emotion and not with the Chabad.
Right. So the nefesh bahamas does start with emotions.
Simply,
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why it starts with emotions. Your intellect. So Tanya does say that your intellect can cause you to sin, most definitely, which would be the animal, the nefesh bahamas intellect. But the reason why the nefesh bahamas starts off with emotions, which is the opposite of mayach shalit al alev, it's leiv mayach al whatever shalit al mayach, right? One second. Let me just explain the process to you. It cannot be, the nefesh bahamas cannot be mayach shalit al alev, because the main dwelling place of the animal soul is in the heart, and the main dwelling place of the godly soul is in the intellect. So that's their starting point. Yes. So can it always be? It is not linear. You're correct. It is not linear, but it will always begin with an involuntary emotion, at least in a Beinoni, not in a tzaddik. Well, a tzaddik doesn't have an animal soul, but in a Beinoni, the involuntary emotion, which is almost sometimes imperceptible, which is why we can think that it could be the opposite direction, will start from the heart and then be justified by the brain. Now, the brain might sometimes not realize that there was an emotion fueling it, but it is, which is why the Alter Rebbe specifies in this chapter that it's the godly emotions and not the animalistic emotions.
But then I don't understand how, if in the beginning of Tanya, it says that the nefesh bahamas has a Chabad and it births emotion, and the nefesh like this has Chabad that birth emotions.
So I have to look that up. I don't think that the Nefesh HaBahamis births emotions from the intellect. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the emotions that it births are more developed emotions. But usually what happens is in the Nefesh HaBahamis is that it births emotions without really the intellect before.
I mean, my understanding is
no. So I'll tell you what. No, so I'll tell you what I'm
is-
thinking. I'll tell you what I'm thinking. And again, I do have to look it up. But what happens is the process is, let's say you feel anger or fear or frustration or whatever it is, right? And then your brain starts justifying it. When your brain starts justifying it, the emotion does grow. And I think that is the result of the intellect. The emotion is a small flame which starts in the left ventricle of the heart that then gets justified by the brain. But when it's justified by the brain, it does grow. So it can become bigger. You can produce a bigger unhealthy emotion, definitely. But in the Nefesh Elikis, the emotion also starts in the heart. It always starts in the heart, but we push away those emotions and we create different emotions. It doesn't necessarily say that it does birth the emotions, but what it does say, Tanya, is that it should birth the emotions. In other words, all the spheres operate not in a linear way, but in a circular way. So, but what we want to happen is actually created in a linear way through the godly side. They're all concurrently doing their thing, all the emotions.
To me, I don't know. For me to understand it better, I see it more of like from a oneness conscious. It's two different consciousnesses. One is a oneness consciousness and a separateness. Like the nefesh is coming from a separateness consciousness, and the nefesh is a oneness consciousness. So from a oneness consciousness, even if I am thinking logically or having Chabad influence my emotions, it's from a oneness.
Yeah, because when you say oneness, you mean a oneness of Hashem.
Yeah,
because it's revealing Hashem. Right. But when Hashem is not revealed, then you feel separate. Yes.
That's the separate. So even if your Chabad is creating emotions, your Nefesh Baham's Chabad that create emotions is coming from a separateness consciousness.
Yeah, but it won't really create, it will fuel emotions, it will create unhealthy emotions, but it does begin from the heart. I'm going to check into more than that.
Even if it starts with the head, it's coming from, it's the consciousness.
It may have been created by Hashem with the wisdom, but it starts off in your heart.
My understanding is that when it starts from the heart, that is when we're dysregulated. Of course, it's going to start from the heart.
Yeah, well, who makes us dysregulated? What makes us dysregulated? Most of us are dysregulated on a daily basis. That's our default state.
Most of the time, but that's
because it comes from the Nefesh Bahamis. That's concealing Hashem.
But in a dysregulated place, you can't have the communication between the two can happen only in Chabad.
No, so in a dysregulated state, your Chabad is working, but against you, not for you. Your Chabad is working to justify. Your intellect is justifying. Have you ever heard a person say, "I'm so angry. You know what she did to me?" Blah, 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 and go on and on and on. You know what she did to me comes from your brain, not from your heart.
You're right. But if you can get to a regulated place, then your Chabad and your of your Nefesh Bahamis and your Chabad of your Nefesh Elikis can communicate. Only when you're
very nice. That is a lot of avodah. In order to bypass that, Tanya gives you a much easier way. You don't have to wait for your Nefesh HaBahamis to be in harmony with your Nefesh Elikis. You can dominate your Nefesh HaBahamis. You can dominate your animal soul because it's like a small town. Alter Rebbe says there cannot be two kings in one country. Either the Nefesh Elikis dominates or the Nefesh HaBahamis dominates. Either the godly soul dominates or the animal soul dominates. When you're not regulated, your animal soul is having a party and dominating you and letting you get away with itself. But in order to bypass that, yes, of course, it all results in oneness. And when your godly soul dominates, then what happens is something very interesting. Your animal soul steps into line and becomes in harmony and works together with your godly soul. But first, there's only one boss. It has to be from the godly soul.
Right. So the way I see it is either a oneness, and you can like tune in and say from a one is consciousness and from a separate, like if you can see that, then you can choose. When I
Yes, that awareness is a precursor to
one
choice.
consciousness,
100%. Yeah, you're right.
that's where you can choose. That's where you can choose.
100%. You need to have that awareness, and the awareness comes from studying things like Tanya. Yes. Okay, anybody else before we pause the recording? The Fabrengen was a little bit on the was on the recorded part today, so that's good.
I want something on the lighter side. I heard that this father took a boy to shopping, and boy was breaking everything, taking stuff off the shelves, and the father keeps on walking calmly around and saying, David, you'll be home soon, just wait a few more minutes. And somebody comes over to him and says, you're such a calm parent, you're talking to him in such a calm voice. He says, yeah, I'm talking to me, David is me. It's me.
I really like that. Oh, I love that. Okay. It's like what we call in modern terms co-regulation. Regulate yourself and then you regulate the other person. Love it. I really, really like that. Wow. Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording.